Hello and welcome again to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, Integrity Deficit Disorder. We have today a special treat concerning Alan Dershowitz, his 50th book, which was launched just this past week. It's titled The Price of Principle and Why Integrity is Worth the Consequences. This is quite a treat, I must say, and I'll give you a little bit of background about Alan Dershowitz. This is his 50th book, The Price of Principle, Why Integrity is Worth the Consequences. New York number one Times best-selling author and one of America's most influential legal scholars, explores the implications of the increasing tendency in politics, academia, media, and even the courts of law to punish principle and reward partisan hypocrisy. Alan Dershowitz has been called one of the most prominent and consistent defenders of civil liberty in America by Politico, and the nation's most peripatetic civil liberties lawyer, and one of its most distinguished defenders of individual rights by Newsweek. Yet he has come under intense criticism for living by his principles and applying his famed shoe on the other foot test. The price of principle is about efforts to cancel Alan Dershowitz and his career because he has insisted on sticking to his principles instead of choosing sides in the current culture and political war dividing our country. He explains that principled people are actively punished for not being sufficiently partisan. Principle has become the vice and partisanship the virtue in an age when partisan ends justify unprincipled means such as denial of due process and free speech in the interest of achieving partisan ideological goals. Throughout his narrative, Dershowitz focuses on three sets of principles that have guided his life. One, freedom of expression and conscience. Two, due process, fundamental fairness, and the adversary system of seeking justice. And three, basic equality and meritocracy. He documents the attacks on him and others like him for being guilty of refusing to compromise important principles to promote partisanship. He names names and points fingers of accusations of those who have led us down this dangerous road. In the end, the price of principle represents an icon in the defense of free speech and due process, reckoning with the challenges of unprincipled attacks, a new brand of McCarthyism, and insisting that we ask hard questions about our own moral principles. Alan Dershowitz, just for his background for you to know, is one of the most celebrated lawyers in the world. He was the youngest full professor in Harvard Law School history, where he is now the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law Emeritus, the author of numerous best-selling books from Chutzpah to Guilt by Accusation to the case against impeaching Trump to the best defense, Reversal of Fortune, which was made into Academy Award-winning film. To defending Israel, Dershowitz has advised presidents and prime ministers and has represented many prominent men and women, half of them pro bono. We're going to begin with the preface. He begins. This is my 50th book. I love writing. I write every day. I try to write 1,500 to 2,000 words a day, just as I try to walk 5 miles a day with my wife and drink a glass of good wine with her, and if I achieve my goals. I have written about a wide array of subjects from criminal and constitutional law, my specialties, to the Bible, American history, Israel, moral philosophy, autobiography, politics, medicine, terrorism, sports, and delicatessen. I have written 3 novels and approximately 1,000 articles, law review, scholarship. Op-eds, magazine articles, and book reviews. I have been told that I have published more, not necessarily better, but words than any Harvard professor in history. I don't recall whether that was meant as a compliment or not. Descartes wrote, I think, therefore I am. For me, it is I write, therefore I am. Recently, I underwent surgery for the removal of my gallbladder that required general anesthesia. My doctor cautioned me that at age 83, the anesthesia might affect my cognitive abilities for a period of time. So as soon as I regained my consciousness, I decided to write an op-ed to see whether my cognition was impaired. While in the recovery room, I typed on op-ed on my phone about the Supreme Court argument on abortion and submitted it. Its substance appears on pages 83 to 89 of this book, so you can judge whether I was compos mentis when I wrote it. Nearly all of my writings are by hand. One year, my secretary estimated that she typed nearly 1 million of my handwritten words. I recently learned how to deep type short ops on my iPhone and dictate a bit, but handwriting is still my primary technique. My handwritten drafts, which I generally preserve at least for a time, once protected me from a false charge of plagiarism. Norman Finkelstein, a virulent anti-Israel hater, tried to discredit my book, The Case for Israel, by claiming that I didn't write it. He said Israeli Mossad ghosted it. When I produced my handwritten draft, he had to withdraw his absurd claim. I hope to continue writing as long as I have the physical strength and mental capacity to do so. 8 of my books have been national bestsellers, including the New York Times #1 bestseller, Chutzpah. To have been made into films, I'm proud of my writing, and I am of my teaching and litigating. This book is about efforts to cancel me and my career because I have insisted on sticking to my principles instead of choosing sides to the current culture and political war dividing our country. My opponents may succeed in temporarily canceling me in certain venues and media, but they can never cancel my writing. The virtue of books, unless they are burned or permanently censored, is they endure beyond any particular era, hence my motivation to continue writing as I approach 84 years old. Boy, should I be so lucky to live that long and still be writing. The introduction. How partisanship trumps principle. We live in an age which partisanship has replaced principle as a dominant guide to actions, attitudes, even friendships. Today, everyone must pick a side and support that side regardless of principles. In philosophy, this is known as the no true Scotsman fallacy. To be a true Scotsman or true Democrat, progressive, Republican, American, Christian, Jew, African American, woman, one must adhere to all positions of the dominant ideology of the group, or else she ceases to be true, woke, progressive, or intersectional in the current jargon. Adhering to principle is not accepted as an excuse, but for deviating from the groupthink on any issue. Everyone is put to a dichotomous choice, be true or be false. That is why, in order to be a true progressive, one must be adamantly anti Israel, even if one's personal principles might incline him to support at least some Israel's policies and actions. Being a true Scotsman means not picking on or choosing based on principle, but adhering to the entire agenda. There is no room for nuance or calibration. Neutral principles are not favored unless they serve the ends of the group. Few today care about passing the shoe on the other foot test for evaluating decisions. What would I do or think if the partisan roles were reversed? Principles have become just another weapon in the war of partisanship. Too many people today follow Groucho Marx's bon mot. Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. Oh, Groucho. It is not as if the world was ever governed by principles alone, even at an earlier time. French free speech and due process, for me, but not for thee, has been the rule rather than the exception for most people, but there have always been a significant number of people for whom principles matter. Today, that number is shrinking, are being pressured to shrink into oblivion. Genuinely principled, neutral people are an endangered species if our age of hyper-partisanship. Nor is this our first era of hyper-partisanship. Although George Washington cautioned against divisive political parties, they have been with us since the end of Washington's second term. Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, and Burr were only among the most visible dividers. The French Revolution, which reversed Jefferson supported and Hamilton opposed, gave rise to the Alien and Sedition Acts by which so-called Jacobins were deported and or prosecuted. Hamilton wrote, in words that may sound familiar to the current ear of the favored weapons of the American Jacobins, namely calumny. A principal engine by which this spirit endeavors to accomplish the purpose is that of calumny. It is essentially to its success that the influences of men of upright principles, disposed and able to resist its enterprises, shall be all events destroyed. Not content with traducing their best efforts of the public good, with misrepresenting their purest motives, with inferring criminality from actions innocent or laudable, the most direct falsehoods are invented and propagated with undaunted infantry and unrelenting perseverance. Lies often detected and refuted are still revived and repeated, and the hope that the refutation may have been forgotten, that the frequency and boldness of accusation may supply the truth and proof. The most profligate men are encouraged, probably bribed, certainly with patronage, if not with money, to become informers and accusers. And when tales which their characteristics alone sought to discredit are refuted by the evidence and facts which oblige the patrons of those to abandon their support, they still continue, corroding whispers, to wear away the reputations which they could not directly subvert. Little has changed in the 2¼ centuries since these words were penned. Principles remain important only as tools of advocacy. Partisan advocacy masquerades as principled argument. Principles are stretched beyond all recognition in an effort to make it seem as if partisan arguments are grounded in principle. But only those who want to be fooled are fooled into believing that these arguments are truly motivated by principled considerations. A little water here, wet my whistle. Thank you very much. Advocates, especially lawyers, are trained to make partisan arguments appear principled because they know that even in an age of partisanship, judges and others who evaluate arguments are more likely to be persuaded if they believe or can claim to believe. The argument is grounded in neutral principles. Many judges and evaluators pretend to believe that the arguments that want to accept reflect principled positions, knowing full well that if the shoe were on the other foot, the advocate would be making precisely the opposite arguments. It wasn't always this bad. Great philosophers, political theorists, and jurists grounded their arguments in neutrally applicable principles. Kant, Bentham, Spinoza, Mill, Rawls, Nozick, and others demanded that their principles, whether one agreed with them or not, be capable of neutral application. Indeed, many of them applied the shoe on the other foot test, though they used different words. John Rawls, most especially, set out a wide-ranging political philosophy that espoused the test most similar to their shoe on the other foot. He contemplated a neither world in which none of us knows whether we will be rich or poor, or male or female, or black or white, or Republican or Democrat, healthy or sick, intelligent or average, young or old. Blinded by this veil of ignorance, we must articulate principles that would be maximally fair to all of us without any of us knowing into which categories we would fit in the real world. So even if one wanted to act out of self or group interest, he could not because he would not know what he would be or what group he would belong to when the time came to apply the principles. Rawls is dead, and tragically so are his principles. They are still solemnly cited by hypocritical academics who openly violate them in the interest of blatant partisanship while pretending they are applying them neutrally. When I was in law school, one of the most prominent professors, Herbert Wechsler, wrote an influential article entitled Toward Neutral Principles of Constitutional Law. Today, many academics would change it to Toward Partisan Principles of Constitutional Law. Isn't that the truth? Many today seem to care first and foremost about the identity of the people. That is why it's called identity politics. Once they identify the objectives of their advocacy, they construct so-called principles in order to advantage those who identity they favor. Identity politics or jurisprudence, such as critical race theory, which is anything but critical about that propagandist theory, intersectionally, which picks and chooses as to which groups are included, are precisely the opposite of the veil of ignorance. Yet, hypocritical academics cite the latter to justify the former, and naive students accept their professors' hypocrisy as the gospel truth because their joint gospel is the so-called progressive or woke agenda which elevates identity over principle. Going back thousands of years, even the Bible demands of judges they do not recognize faces, that they render justice behind a veil of ignorance regarding the identity of the litigants. That commandment, the rule, which against identity judging, precedes even the prohibition against accepting bribes. Yet today, faces come before fairness, identity become equality, and partisanship before principles. Today, principled people are actively punished for not being sufficiently partisan. Principle has become the vice, and partisanship, the virtue in an age when partisan ends justify unprincipled means, such as denial of due process and free speech, in which the interest of achieving partisan or ideological goals. Fairness and equality have become microaggressions in an age where these time-tested principles have been equated with white privilege. University rules regard meritocracy as not only wrong but racist. In this topsy-turvy, brave new world, it is a microaggression to say that the most qualified person deserves the job, except, of course, if one is undergoing surgery or flying in tempestuous weather, when any rational person would want their surgeon or pilot to be the most qualified. In this short book, I will document this frightening devolution from principle to partisanship. I will argue that in the attempt to achieve a utopia of identifying politics, we are on the road to a dystopia of partisanship and discrimination. I will name names and point fingers of accusations as those who have led us down this dangerous road. I will use my own experience as an advocate who insists on placing principle before partisanship, and I will document the attacks on me and others like me who are guilty of today's most heinous political offensive, refusing to compromise important principles to promote partisanships. In 1956, then Senator John Kennedy wrote a book entitled Profiles in Courage, which raised 8 former senators who placed principle above partisanship and even above their own careers. Today, people still say they admire such principled courage, while at the same time punishing those who have displayed it when its disadvantages, the hypocrites who punish them. Courage for me, but not for thee, is the mantra in our current age of partisan divide. In Partisan Divide, David Brooks, writing in the New York Times, says that today we need social courage to cross group lines and to have conversations, because politics is no longer about argument. It's just jamming together a bunch of scary categories about people who are allegedly rotten to the core. Brooks notes, citing Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah, that contemporary politics is almost all about identity, about which type of person is going to dominate. This post-World War II emphasis on identity domination makes the death knell of principle as a modifying factor in decision making. I will focus on 3 sets of principles that have dominated my life. 1, freedom of expression and conscience. 2, due process, fundamental fairness, and the adversary system of seeking justice. And 3, basic equality and meritocracy. I will consider other principles as well, but these 3 are central to any decent democracy and to the proper rule of law. I will subject all of my arguments to the shoe on the other foot test and stand behind only those that pass it. The Bible commands justice, justice, must you pursue? And the commentators ask why the word justice is repeated. Many answers have been given: procedural as well as substantive justice, justice to victim as well as accused, justice along with mercy. The one most appropriate to this book is that rule of principle cannot be just for me. It must also be for them, for thee. True, justice must be a two-way street. What is good for the goose must be good for the gander. Rabbi Hillel expounded on his concept when he summarized the Torah as setting out on an early version of the Golden Rule. What is hateful to you, you do to your fellow man. These are prescriptions of principled rather than partisan or identity justice. They are opposed to identity politics, critical race theory, and intersectionality. When I was growing up, my grandmother, a refugee from the anti-Semitism of Poland, judged matters by her own variation of critical race theory. She would ask the same question about everything, ranging from the outcomes of elections to the results of baseball games. Is it good or bad for Jews? Question mark. Her parochial question based on what can be denominated uncritical Jew theory was understandable in the light of her history, and perhaps it is understandable for some African Americans, gays, women, and others who have experienced discrimination to ask whether it is good or bad for their particular group rather than for Americans in general or the world at large. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes taught us that the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. As I demonstrated in my 2005 book, Rights from Wrongs, experience is more than the life of law and is the basis of all human rights. Philosophy is often autobiography, but experiences are not static. They change over time for individuals as well as for groups. While this self-serving question, is it good for my group, might be understandable at some stages in a group's evolution, it is not the right question for a society consisting of multiple overlapping racial, religious, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, political, ideological, and other groups. What is good for any particular group may not be good policy for an entire nation. In a democracy, the needs and the preferences of every group must be taken into account and then balanced against the needs and the preferences of all groups and individuals. A fair and effective democracy must have processes and procedures for balancing these factors and arriving at just a resolution. No group would have a veto, nor should any group be ignored. The rules for resolving contentious and divisive issues must be systematically fair, favoring or disfavoring no group or individual. And fairness requires neutral principles, not identity or partisan preferences. This is the challenge of a democracy, governed by the rule of law. The thesis of this book is that we are not meeting this challenge. To the contrary, we are punishing principle and rewarding unprincipled partisanship and identity politics. We are discouraging young people from living lives of principle by canceling, ostracizing, and condemning those who place principle over result-oriented partisanship. We are teaching students by example that they will be better off between being politically correct than principally consistent. They see how those who refuse to pick sides are treated as pariahs, while those who are prepared to sacrifice principle on the altar of partisanship are rewarded. As a law professor and defense lawyer for nearly 60 years, I am particularly concerned about the impact this punishment of principle is having on those contemplating careers in the law or politics. since a young John Adams defended the hated British soldiers who were accused of killing American patriots in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Principled criminal defense lawyers have defended hated individuals with whose actions they personally disagree. This honorable tradition was followed by the likes of Daniel Webster, Abraham Lincoln, Clarence Darrow, Thurgood Marshall, Edward Bennett Williams, and many other brave lawyers whose names are not remembered by history. Some were praised by supporting the constitutional right to counsel. Others were praised for supporting the constitutional right to counsel. Others were condemned. Many went on to distinguished careers at the bar and in politics. Others were forgotten. Never before, with the exception of McCarthyism, about which I will write shortly, have such principled lawyers been punished to the degree that have been recently. I will describe these punishments in detail in forthcoming chapters, including recent attacks by some Republican senators against judicial nominees who have served as public defenders. It is enough to say here in this introduction that many law students and young lawyers have told me, and others, that they will never become defense lawyers, having witnessed the personal and professional attacks on me and others who have put principle before partisanship. My own research assistant told me that he completely agreed with my Senate defense of President Trump against unconstitutional impeachment charges, but that he could not assist me for fear that his participation would result in his being blackballed for future jobs. Others have told me of similar concerns. They are not wrong, as a matter of fact. This is both a tragedy and a danger to the rule of law. Among the precipitating causes of this decisive shift was the election and incumbency of Donald Trump. Many on the left and even some in the center regarded him as such an existential threat to their values that anyone who helped him in any way was damned as an enabler. Even their actions were based on long-standing unconstitutional principles. It was similar to what I remember as a student when international communism was seen by many on the right and the same in the center as an existential threat to the American way of life. The Soviet Union had seized control of much of Eastern and Central Europe. Cuba and China were ruled by communists. Nikita Khrushchev threatened to bury America. In the United States, communists and other communists were alleged to be in positions of authority in sensitive governmental jobs. Many were thought to be in academia and the entertainment industry. Regardless of whether this fear was exaggerated, I think it was widely believed. Many Americans in the 1950s were as frightened of communism as many on the left and in the center were fearful of Trump in the recent past and even now. Anyone who was seen as assisting communism in any way was condemned as a fellow traveler. They were persecuted, ostracized, and worse if they had acted on principle, and many anti-communist civil libertarian lawyers did. There was and is a similar reaction to Trumpism. Principle is among the first casualties of fear. It is regarded as an affordable luxury at a time when results are needed. And the result that was most needed by those who were frightened was the defeat of Trump and his policies by any means, regardless of principles or process. And anyone who stood in the way of that essential result, whether on the basis of principle or partisanship, was regarded as a Trump enabler, supporter, and water carrier, even if he or she voted against him and strongly supported his opponents. The same had been true of anti-communists who defended the civil liberties and constitutional rights of communists under McCarthyism. The difference is that the old McCarthyism was directed by the right against left-wing and centrist civil libertarians, whereas the new McCarthyism is directed by the left against anyone who dares to defend the constitutional rights of Trump and his allies. The victims of both iterations of McCarthyism are the same: civil libertarians who place principle above partisanship. I know, because I'm one of these victims, and as I will show, I'm paying a high price for acting on principles. But I'm fighting back. I refuse to accept victimhood for doing the right thing. I am fighting both to defend my own integrity and to encourage young women and men to live principled lives, to resist the slings and arrows that have been directed at me and others, and to continue to the noble traditions of Adams, Lincoln, Darrow, and Marshall by zealously defending the constitutional rights of the despised, the guilty, the dangerous, and even the political pariahs. I write about myself because I am among the most high-profile defense lawyers who have been attacked, canceled, for my defense of the Constitution on behalf of former President Trump and others. New York Magazine characterized me as his generation's answer to Clarence Darrow, the legendary attorney for the damned. I hope I can live up to that compliment. I have been called, for better or worse, the best-known criminal lawyer in the world. Accordingly, if the attack on me succeeds, it will have an explosionary impact on young people considering careers similar to mine. If I don't want to be Dershowitz, one law student told me, but if being Dershowitz means being punished for placing principle before partisanship, I want young people to be proud of being Dershowitz, to fight back against such punishment. In the chapters to come, I will elaborate on the important principles that are at the stake in the attacks on me, the attacks on me and others, how these principles are being subordinated to partisan and identity politics, and why dialogue, debate, and open-mindedness have been replaced by ad hominem bumper stickers. I will point out the main culprits in this attack on principles and provide numerous examples of this new brand of McCarthyism at work. Finally, I will warn about the broad implications of punishing principle and rewarding partisanship, and try to answer the most difficult question of all. Can we reverse this dangerous trend, or are we destined to live for the foreseeable future in a divided world in which partisanship trumps principle? Question mark. Hence this book. Wow, that's really something. The more I read about Alan Dershowitz, he's got a lot going for him in terms of his words, his energy, his thoughts, and he's going to bring it on more, bring it on a great deal more, because I think that's what he's attempting to do, is to have people look at themselves and look at the others and decide if they want to live on principles or if they want to live on partisanships. And I can tell you my answer. I'll do my best to not be a partisan. And I want to think that this is, it's in a way that will bring this to, I think it's going to be exciting. I think there are ways and things that you can do in terms of principles or positions or thoughts or those types of things that will allow you to convey your own principles and to allow others that they can do the same without a boxing match. It's been good my reading here today, it's kind of surprised me. I got some chills and some spots on my arms as I read. It's um, it's very important that the background laid down here is quite a mess. I want to thank you, listeners, for having the the joy in listening to this beginning of Adam Dershowitz. He's a great man, and I want to thank you for listening to my show, Searching for Integrity. And I'm happy that you have pushed me over the threshold of 500, creeping on 600, and we're going to get a big number out there about this because searching for integrity is is maximum importance. So, long and happy trails to all. John Smith, adios.